Chapter 21. Oceans Cannot Put Ghosts to Rest. Finally, school did reopen, and I was very excited at being allowed to return. No longer did I feel like a worthless prisoner whose life meant nothing to anybody. At last, someone was looking at me as a teenager with a future, worthy of being educated. But the school to which I returned was drastically changed. Nearly half my classmates from 1939 were either dead or in prison. In my class, everyone had been a veteran of the war, either as a member of the Wehrmacht or the Hitler Youth. All teachers who had been Nazi Party members were now barred from teaching. This meant there was a huge shortage of good instructors. Many of my class had 80 or more students. The Allies decided what we would learn. We studied neutral subjects like Latin, English, French, science, and math. But history we avoided like the plague, because everyone was too confused about the war to know what to teach us. Both in our classrooms and outside of school, there was very little talk of the war. I seemed to be the only one who was interested, and this made me feel isolated from my classmates. I began to brood about my life under Hitler, and was haunted by the memories. The deeper my thoughts, the more I knew I had to do something if I were going to put to rest the ghosts of the past. It was my brother Rudolf who, without realizing it, helped me decide what to do. Alphonse's twin brother had recently arrived from Oberhausen on a bicycle, having ridden more than 130 miles over rubble-strewn roads to reach the farm. During the war, Rudolf had fought with the Wehrmacht, but unlike his brother, he had never been a fanatic Hitler Youth member. Rudolf was putting the war behind him, but he could see that his brother was not. Alphonse was struggling with his past, trying to find a way to explain the horrible truths the world was learning about the Third Reich. Even though he himself had committed no crimes, he carried the guilt for his entire generation. Other people seemed able to block or erase the Hitler years from their memories. Alphonse could not. In order to deal with this heavy burden, he needed to find some answers. In the city of Nuremberg, about 300 miles from Wittlich, the high-ranking Nazis of Hitler's Third Reich were now being put on trial for crimes committed during the war. "Maybe you ought to go," Rudolf jokingly suggested. "It might help to see your former heroes in the dock." The suggestion planted a seed in Alphonse's mind. Maybe he should go to Nuremberg. Maybe there he would find some answers. During the next few weeks, the idea grew into a fixation. He had to go. But how? He was forbidden to leave the French zone of occupation, and Nuremberg lay in the American zone. It took some fancy talking with a French officer before Alphonse was at last granted permission to leave. Boarding a third-class passenger train, he set out across an obstacle course of broken rail lines and blown-up bridges, headed for the once splendid city of Nuremberg. I knew that Nuremberg, with its spectacular castle and massive 16th-century gates, had been hit hard by the Allied bombings. But still, I was not prepared for what I saw. It was night when the train entered this ancient center of the German Empire. As we neared the middle of the city, there were huge gaps between the few buildings still standing. Soon, only continuous walls of rubble lined the streets on both sides. The destruction was so complete that I didn't even recognize the train station. Perhaps because of the rubble, the Allies had chosen Nuremberg for the trials. This grand city had once been a symbol of Nazi power, the place where Hitler had celebrated his great victories. Here is where the annual Reichsparteitag, the massive rally of the Nazi Party, had been held. And it was here, in 1935, that the Nuremberg racial laws had been issued, robbing Jews of their citizenship. It seemed fitting now to make Nuremberg the nation's city of shame. On trial at the Palace of Justice were 22 high-ranking leaders of the Third Reich. But the faces of several other top Nazis were missing. Adolf Eichmann had escaped to Argentina, where he would hide out until his discovery by the Israelis in 1960. Joseph Goebbels, chief of propaganda for the Third Reich, had committed suicide shortly after Hitler at the bunker in Berlin. Having first poisoned their 6 children, Goebbels and his wife then ordered themselves shot to death by an SS guard. The blonde beast, Reinhard Heydrich, was not at Nuremberg. On May 27, 1942, Heydrich, organizer of the Final Solution, had been assassinated in Czechoslovakia. In revenge, the Germans had burned the entire village of Litis, killed all its men, and sent its women and children to concentration camps. Heinrich Himmler, the fearsome head of the Gestapo and the SS, was also missing. Himmler had been captured by the British on May 23, 1945, as he tried to flee across a checkpoint from northern Germany into Bavaria. Seeing what fate lay before him, he committed suicide by swallowing a cyanide capsule. Also among the missing was Dr. Joseph Mengele, the Angel of Death, who, by a flick of his thumb, had decided the fate of so many Jews at Auschwitz and performed bizarre medical experiments on thousands of others. At the end of the war, Mengele escaped to South America. He was successful at hiding out there for the rest of his life and died of natural causes in 1977. Robert Ley, the Nazi labor leader who had visited Alphonse and his Hitler Youth units when they were digging trenches along the West Wall, was supposed to be tried at Nuremberg. But before the trial began, Ley hanged himself in a cell by stuffing underwear in his mouth and tying a towel around his neck. One of the 22 Nazis scheduled for trial was not present in the courtroom. That was Martin Bormann, Hitler's private secretary. Some said Bormann had been killed while trying to escape during the final Battle of Berlin. Hitler Youth leader Arthur Axmann claimed to have seen his body near a bridge not far from Hitler's bunker. Although he was never located, Bormann was put on trial, found guilty in absentia, and sentenced to death. A warrant was issued for his arrest. Nearly 3 decades later, in 1972, Berlin construction workers unearthed the skeletons of 2 men near the bridge where Axmann claimed to have seen the bodies. Skull and dental tests showed that one was Martin Bormann, the other one Hitler's private doctor. Between their teeth were small bits of glass, confirming a rumor that they had bitten into glass vials of cyanide to commit suicide. After 27 years, the warrant for Bormann's arrest was finally canceled. The Nazis accused at Nuremberg were tried on 4 counts: planning to commit crimes, crimes against the peace, they had started the war crimes, mistreatment of prisoners and unnecessary destruction of cities, and crimes against humanity, the inhumane treatment of civilians. The highest-ranking Nazi to stand trial was Hermann Goering, Hitler's second in command. After his arrest in May, Goering had been taken to a detention center where top Nazis were held under guard to await trial. Goering had arrived at the center so overweight that it took 2 men to lift him out of his car. Among the items he brought with him were enough gold, silver, and precious stones to open a small jewelry store. His finger and toenails were painted with bright red polish, and in one of his 15 monogram suitcases, he carried 20,000 narcotic pills, of which he took 40 a day. Goering, along with several other accused leaders, seemed both defiant and bored throughout the trials, and even laughed at the occasional mistakes in the translations. Rudolf Hess, who had helped Hitler write Mein Kampf, was another of the top Nazis on trial. Sitting next to Hess in the courtroom was Hitler's good friend Julius Streicher, owner of the popular anti-Semitic newspaper Der Stürmer, whose motto was, "Jews are our misfortune." Near Streicher, in the dock, sat Hans Frank, the savage and much-feared governor of Nazi-occupied Poland. The youngest defendant at Nuremberg was Baldur von Schirach, first leader of the Hitler Youth and later the most powerful Nazi in Austria. Born in Berlin in 1907, Schirach was actually 3/4 American. His grandfather had been an honorary pallbearer at Abraham Lincoln's funeral. From his very first days in power, Hitler had admired the way Schirach handled the Hitler Youth. In fact, when he occasionally met an adult who refused to believe in him, Der Fuhrer would remind that person, "Your child belongs to me already." I hope that hearing Baldur von Schirach would give me some answers as to why I had become so caught up in Nazism. For a long time, I'd been waiting to hear a German say, "I am guilty." But nobody seemed to utter these three simple words, including me. It was Schirach, the man I had respected most next to Hitler, who just might say it. He seemed to be the one German ready to take responsibility for having led us children down such a dark path. Schirach idolized Hitler and trained the youth of Germany to believe in him without question. "I organized for him a group of youth that would look up to him as I did," Schirach admitted during his trial. "It is my guilt that I trained them for a man who would become a murderer 1,000,000 times over." It was these and other gods of the Third Reich that Alphonse had come to Nuremberg to see. A few months earlier, he had followed their orders blindly. Now, he knew he might spend the rest of his life trying to live down their deeds. As I listened more of Schirach's statements during the trial, my feeling of loyalty to him began to die. I was outraged when I heard his excuse for deporting Jews to concentration camps while he was governor of Vienna, Austria. He claimed it would be better for the Jews. He considered deportation to the eastern ghettos a contribution to European culture. But lies! In all the newspaper articles and textbooks Schirach had written for the Hitler Youth, he had referred to Jews as the enemy and told us that Jews deserved no mercy. He even blamed the war on the international Jewish conspirators. Schirach had been a true anti-Semite, and now he was trying to deny it? Whatever his feelings toward the Jews may have been, Schirach clearly wanted the court to believe his Hitler Youth were innocent. Perhaps he hoped that by trying to clear the youngsters of any wrongdoing, it would somehow make him look more honorable. On August 31, 1946, at the end of the trials, the defendants were given one last chance to speak. This is what Schirach had to say. "I wish to state with a clear conscience to our German youth that they are completely innocent of the atrocities of the Hitler regime. They know nothing of the many acts of horror that has been committed by the Germans." Then he asked the court to help the young people of Germany by creating an atmosphere that is free of hatred and vengeance. Schirach's concern for the Hitler Youth looked to Alphonse like a smokescreen, designed to cover up the role he had played in the mass murder of the Jews. He may have hoped to turn attention away from his other crimes by focusing on the Hitler Youth. There was no way of telling if it would work until the trials ended. On October 1, 1946, the day the verdicts were read, security around the massive, mud-colored Palace of Justice was tight. It was a cold, gray, drizzly Tuesday. I stood leaning against a lamppost, staring at the somber front of the building. A loudspeaker had been mounted near the entrance so the many reporters who could not get into the courtroom could hear the verdicts being read. I stood close enough to understand the English-speaking announcer and waited to hear the fates of the last leaders of the Third Reich. Because he was the top remaining Nazi, the first one to be sentenced was Hermann Göring, commander-in-chief of the Luftwaffe and creator of the Gestapo. "Defendant," the loudspeaker boomed, "the International Military Court sentences you to death by hanging." As his verdict was read, Göring's head dropped into his hands. His air of self-confidence dissolved into despair. Before the trials began, Göring had sworn that only he would decide when he was to die. Now he was ready to cheat the hangman and follow through on that promise. Just how Göring got the cyanide capsule into his cell is still not known, but shortly before he was to be hanged, he committed suicide by swallowing the poison. Guards loaded Göring's body onto a truck and hauled it to the Dachau concentration camp, along with the bodies of other executed Nazis. Here they were burned, in the same ovens where the Jewish victims had earlier burned. Hans Frank and Julius Streicher, along with 8 other top Nazis, were sentenced to death by hanging. Rudolf Hess, whose mental state had slipped gravely during the trial, was ordered to spend the rest of his life in prison. This he did until 1987, when he at last committed suicide. Baldur von Schirach got off much easier. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison, which he served, and died of natural causes in 1974. Alphonse was enraged by Schirach's sentence. He felt this man should have dangled beside the other 11 on the gallows. Deeply upset, he wandered through the ruins of Nuremberg as the dust began to descend on the ancient city. It was nearly dark when I reached my destination. Almost without thinking, I had retraced my footsteps from 1938 and arrived at the huge stadium where hundreds of thousands of Hitler Youth, myself included, had once greeted Adolf Hitler with storms of Sieg Heil. I sat on the lowest row of stone benches and looked at the granite pillar where the German eagle and the swastika had once loomed over the field. Here, in the thin, cold drizzle, I at last began to separate myself from my worship of Nazism. My healing had started, a slow, torturous process that would take many years. It was one thing to lose a war after such monstrous sacrifices, but to be shouldered with the burden of genocide, the intentional slaughter of an entire race of people, that was too heavy to bear. Like most of my countrymen, I was not yet ready to carry this enormous burden, but I knew that none of the Germans could ever deny the shameful evidence. I would never understand, let alone accept, the mindless slaughter of so many millions of people simply because they were inferior. I could claim that because of my youth, I had been used, made victim of the Nazi system. It was true. Many years later, German Chancellor Helmut Kohl would use what he called the mercy of late birth to free himself of any guilt over his days in the Hitler Youth. Kohl had been 14 years old at war's end, and, because of his age, was presumed innocent. Still, I had known plenty of 14-year-olds in my units who had killed Americans. These were not naive children. They were hardened veterans, very capable of adult deeds. When I rose from the stone bench in the stadium, I was alone in the vast oval where once the shouts of 250,000 people had welcomed their savior. Thinking back to those days, I knew that I could never deny how enthusiastic I had been about our glorious new age. Nor could I deny that the memory of the trumpet fanfares echoing across the field excited me even now. None of us who were teenagers at the time will ever shake the legacy of our Führer. Although he took advantage of our faithfulness to him and sacrificed millions of us for a cruel cause, there would always be that memory of power, fanfares, and flags proclaiming our glorious future. Today, Germany belongs to us, and tomorrow the world, we shouted in our Hitler Youth anthem. We believed it. At dawn on a cold October morning in 1950, Alphonse went into his grandmother's bedroom and hugged her for the last time. When he tore himself loose from her, she cried out, "I'll never see you again. Please don't leave." And though he promised her he would be back, it was a promise he never kept, one that would haunt him forever. At this moment, though, his mind was made up. He was leaving, heading for Canada, escaping his past and looking for a future where he could be anonymous, no longer a citizen of the most hated country on earth. For a while, the escape worked. Alphonse was able to lose himself in a country that seemed not to hate Germans. No one asked about his past, and he never had to mention the words Nazi or Hitler Youth. By the time he moved to the United States 13 years later, much of the horror of the Hitler years had slipped into people's memories. But in Alphonse's mind, the ghost of the past still lingered. None of us who rose to any high rank in the Hitler Youth could say we had a clear conscience. All of us, perhaps unknowingly, had looked the other way, preferring not to know the truth. Sadly, now we are the other part of the Holocaust, the generation burdened with the responsibility for Auschwitz. This is our life sentence for having been the enthusiastic followers of Adolf Hitler.